All right. Well, welcome to our webinar today, Thursday, March 5th. It's going to be focused on second language instructional strategies. And as usual, we will kick off with our disclaimer. This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number ED-ESE 15A0015/0006 with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred.
Excuse me.
So as we get going today, a couple of kind of housekeeping pieces. If you are having trouble either coming on camera or coming off camera to show your image, all of those things, as well as your audio, turning on and off audio, are up at the top of your screen. So there should be a little microphone for your audio and a little camera looking icon for your video. And then that's also where you'll be able to access chat. So if you want to pop any questions or comments in the chat box as we go along, you can access that up there as well. And then I know many of you have been on, we've used Annotate before. That's also up in that top toolbar, and so we'll be using that a little bit later. Now, before we get into our content for today, I wanted to give a few reminders about some other webinars that we do have archived and available that are on similar or related topics to what we'll be discussing today. We do have our curriculum and assessment webinar from May 2018, and then where we took deeper dives into curriculum and assessment separately in January and May of last year. And then in August, we had our webinar on culture-based education. All of those are archived, both the recordings and the handouts, and available on the resource database if that's something you or your team would like to go back and review. But for today, we're going to be focused on exploring a variety of second language instructional strategies and methods, discussing considerations specific to native language educators, and discovering resources to continue building knowledge of second language instructional strategies. And this webinar was actually built off of the feedback that we received from everyone last year in your surveys and areas that you were hoping to explore a little more this year in technical assistance. So I want to start by introducing our guest experts for the day, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you and give you a little bit more information about themselves. So I will start with Dr. Kickham.
Halito, Chimachokma, Liz Kickham Sohochafat, Chatamicha Scottish Sia. So I just said hi, my name is Liz Kickham. I have Scottish heritage and Choctaw heritage, and that is what actually led me to doing the work that I do with language. I'm very interested in how to revitalize language and how to teach language within that context so that students can learn most efficiently. So I am Director of American Indian Studies at Idaho State University. I've worked at the University of Arizona in the Department of Linguistics and the University of Oklahoma in the Department of Anthropology, and with ALDI, American Indian Language Development Institute, and the Native American Youth Language Fair. And so this is just what I do, and I love it.
Thank you. And now I'll let Dr. Met introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Minnie Met, and I have worked in the field of language education and second language learning for a very, very long time. I've been a classroom teacher, a university level teacher trainer. I've worked, for those of you who are working with young learners, I've worked with early language learners for decades, and in different models such as, excuse me, the kind of program where students have a language period 2 to 3 times a week for 30 to 40 minutes, all the way up to an hour a day. And I've worked with different models of immersion instruction. I've worked with about 9 or 10 different world languages, including ESL. And I myself learned English as my third language. You'll hear occasionally the fact that I learned English from a teacher in Brooklyn, New York, because it slips out just when I don't think it's going to happen. But I have worked with many teachers over a long period of time, and there's nothing that gives me more pleasure then helping teachers help their students be successful language learners. So I hope you're going to hear something this afternoon that will help you do that.
Thank you. All right, we will jump back into our presentation view. We're really excited to have both of our experts on today, and I think you're going to get some great ideas to take back to your classroom. But we also want to get some ideas from all of you. All of you do amazing things in your classrooms. I see that when I come out to your sites and visit. And so I just want to give you fair warning that later in the webinar, we're going to be asking you to share at least one instructional strategy that you use that you feel like has been really effective in your classroom. So be mulling that over, thinking about what it is that you want to share with your colleagues and that could be of benefit in their classrooms as well. But we're going to jump right into discussing some language learning methods and kick it off with a poll. So when you think about language learning, how do you know when a student has learned? And Sarah will pop the poll up where you can answer right there on the easy to do screen. And is it because they can point to, touch, or show a picture of the new word taught? Maybe it's because they can answer a yes/no question or an either/or question. They can use a new word to answer a question. They can read a new word and match it with a picture. They can write a label for a picture. They can translate from the native language to English. Maybe it's all of those things or a mixture. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's just, how do you typically assess when a student has learned a new word? All right. Looks like we have almost all of our answers in. Perfect. Now, someone realized you can click more than one answer. So you should be able to see the results. It looks like we have some folks who it's because they can indicate a picture of the word, answer a question, or use it to answer a question, match it with a picture. But a lot of you went with all of those things or some of those things, some mixture of that. So let's take a little bit closer look at what it means to learn a new word and in general, a new language. So we're going to look at a word, and this is when you're going to get a chance to actually annotate on the screen. And I know everyone normally likes the idea that you can write on your screen. So remember, if you go to the top of your screen, you should see that you're viewing Sarah Brightwell's screen, and then that will give you the annotate option. Once you're in annotate, you can use a check, you can use an X, whatever you would like to be able to indicate one of your answer choices. So our first word is Umoja. Now, you've either never heard that word before, you've heard it before, but you're really not clear on what it means. You've heard it before and you think you have some idea what it means, or you've heard it before and you know what it means. You can use it in your speaking, you can use it in your writing. All right. So a good bit of us have found our annotation tools. And it looks like most of you have never heard this word before. So would it help if I showed you a symbol that would be associated with the meaning of this word? Now, based on this symbol, does anybody want to unmute and tell me what you think this word might mean? Anybody feeling like a guess? And if you're having trouble unmuting, your microphone is in the top bar and it's all the way over on the left. I know sometimes that's a little difficult to locate. And if you don't have a speaker on your computer today, any of the times that we're doing discussion, you're welcome to put in the chat box and then we'll read it out for you.
Hey, Sarah.
Yes.
Is it like an emoji?
Okay, like an emoji? It is not, but that's a very good guess.
Okay.
And I appreciate you putting yourself out there and giving us a guess.
I would guess United.
Yeah, maybe
there's some-
United.
United. They chatted.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and Flora was chiming in kind of the same. So we've got kind of two thinking united. All right, so I'll tell you the meaning of this word is unity or oneness. But you could see how that was hard to tell. It's not a word you've had any exposure to before. It's not a word that you could break down using your existing language knowledge. And the symbol was okay. Some of you were able to get that united out of it, but that's not the clearest symbol, because just like Mila was saying, I could see how you could see an emoji in there too. There's some ambiguity to this symbol. So we're coming along, but this would be challenging to use for language learning. Now I've got to clear off our screen, so bear with me 1 second. And let's try again. What about the word hygge? And you can write right on the screen, and I know you're thinking, that does not equal hygge, but I promise it does. It's a Danish word, and I promise it's pronounced hygge. So it looks like we have some who've never heard it before. All right, looks like we're leaning toward not hearing this one before. All of you will have to go Google it after this webinar so you can read a very entertaining news series in the Times about hygge. All right, now with this one, since the symbol didn't really work out for us, how about if we use a more realistic picture? Now, based on this, who wants to fathom a guess on what hygge is?
Oh, I did hear this word before.
Oh, so did the picture make you remember?
Yes.
And what does it mean?
It means to be comforted. You put a blanket around yourself. You sit in front of the fireplace and you relax.
Yeah, and it's funny, Flora put in the chat box, relax, right as you were explaining that. So she was coming right along with you.
I need some hygge.
Yeah, we could all use some hygge. So yeah, it's comfort, it's coziness, it's feeling well and content. But this one's kind of challenging too. Most of us had never heard it before. And like Susan was saying, even though she'd heard it before, it wasn't something she had much experience with. So until there was an image to go with it, it really wasn't ringing a bell. And even with this image, could you get any other meanings out of the picture? Probably. We've had people think maybe it's socks, maybe it has to do with warmth. So we're getting better, but it's still challenging because we just have this one picture with a word that we don't know a ton about. Now let me clear that off. And this is our final word. You're all going to have a lot of new words tomorrow. So this one is impecunious. Now this one is an English word. Our first word was Arabic, our second was Danish, and this one is an English word. So I'll give you a moment to vote there on the screen. Have you heard that one before? Do you know what to do with it? Impecunious. Oh, somebody got the fancy arrow now. So it looks like we all think we've heard it before, but we don't really know what it means or what we do with it. And that seems very likely. It's not the most common word. It is actually on the top 300 most difficult SAT words. So we'll start out with, we've got a symbol slash picture. We've kind of gone with a duo here. Anybody want to take a guess? Flora, no money.
Broke.
Yeah, no money, broke.
Pobre.
Yes, pobre. So, yes, it's not having enough money to pay for your necessities. So this one, we were able to do a little bit more with. And we had somebody who'd actually heard it before and they said they knew what to do with it. Then we had a few that had heard it before but didn't know what to do with it. And then one who'd never heard it. So this one, we'd had a little bit more exposure. Was it helpful at all that it was an English word that you could use some of the pieces and parts of?
No.
not so much. Now, what about our other picture option? I want to give you options here. What if we were to use something like this with a little cartoon? I'd rather be impecunious than spend most of my time worrying about the value of the dollar. And he's confused, and we've got how to spell it. And then it comes down to our definition. So was this one easier than the first two? Or harder, or about the same? About the same? Let's see. Oh, and Flora was pointing out it helped to have the definition on this last picture. So since it's a word that we're not familiar with, instead of having to start out guessing, having that information. Yeah. All right. So as you think about these different images and these different new words and how we went about figuring them out, we're going to talk a little bit more about how to make the most effective use of learning words and what kind of lessons can we take from these examples we've looked at, and what things were in there that aren't great things to use when we're learning new words. So I'm going to let Mimi take it away on the next slide to talk a bit about saliency.
Thank you, Sarah. When we're learning things, we're paying attention and we're motivated, then we're more likely to notice some things than others. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of talking to someone and they use a word or an expression, you go, oh, that's a good way to say it, or, oh, now I know how to say that correctly. I've never heard that before. When I was in elementary school, I noticed that every time I said Wichita Falls, my classmates laughed because it wasn't the right way to say it. Now, that's a bad example of noticing, but what we want to do is get our students to notice important new words. And actually, we do this very naturally. We make those words salient, that is, we make them stand out. We make them easy to notice in some way so that they catch the attention of the student. So when we create saliency, when we make things noticeable, one of the things we do, we might pause before we say a word like salient. We make a word salient sometimes because we're saying it louder than some of the other syllables or sounds that we're producing. Or we may stress a word like, that's what he thinks. We're adding stress to a word that might be important in the message. You know, we actually do a lot of this naturally in real life with first language development. So I'm going to take some examples from English. Now, first and second language development are not always the same. There are lots and lots of differences, but in this one way, they're similar. And that is that when we speak naturally, whether it's to our students or to our children, we tend to pronounce important words more slowly and clearly than unimportant words. Here's an example. A child comes up to his mother and he says, which is totally unintelligible. And the mother says, oh, you want some more. You want some more. What is the word that is most noticeable? You want some more. Oh, do you want milk? Can you say bye-bye? The words that we stress in everyday language are the words that children learn first. If children learn the words first that they hear most often, the, and of might be children's first words. And in fact, if you were to raise your hand and I said, Raise your hand if your child's first word was the. I'll bet nobody's raising their hands right now in your room. Is that correct? The is a word that doesn't carry a lot of important information, and we don't pronounce it in a way when we're speaking that gives it a lot of attention. What we do is we don't make it salient, we don't make it noticeable. So I'm wondering if you happen to notice that I was doing something when I was talking about the idea of something being salient or something being noticeable. Anybody notice what I did? Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Sarah, can you help me here?
Was that me? Louder or emphasize?
I did. I said it louder. How did I emphasize it? Do you remember?
Salient.
Okay, so I pronounced it more clearly and I said it more slowly and I paused before I said it. Did you know what the word salient meant before I used it? Some of you might have and some of you might not. But do you think you know what it means now? It's to make something noticeable. To make it stand out is to make it salient. So we do this in textbooks through print very often. We do it through making important vocabulary or statements in bold text or italics, or even highlighting phrases or words that we want our students to pay attention to. So the big idea of language learning is we learn the things that we notice, the things that we pay attention to. And it's that paying attention to something that causes the brain to process for meaning and to store that meaning so that it's available for use again. So you already know from what I've seen of the excellent learning environments in some of the classroom photos that Sarah has shown us is the importance of showing pictures or using real objects. Even subtitles for video can be helpful for kids in terms of an opportunity to connect sound with its meaning, its real life meaning, particularly when that's done in a real life context. What's wonderful about auditory enhancements is there isn't a lot of preparation for you as a teacher to think about how can I use my voice to make my students pay attention to things I want them to hear clearly in the input. Because one of the things that we're going to point out over and over again through the examples that Sarah has already given you and things that we're going to talk about more is that if you've never heard a word before, you don't speak it, you don't pronounce it, you don't write it. If you heard it before, but you're not sure what it means, are you going to use that word? Probably not, because we don't use words that we don't really understand or know. We only are able to produce words that we quote unquote own. When we own a word, we understand it when we hear it. We know how to use it to say what we want to say, to convey our own meanings. And understanding language, internalizing the meanings of words, storing the meanings of those words in your brain is what allows you to be able to speak. So if I can leave you with one big message about instructional strategies, it's this. If a student has not retained the meaning of a word or a structure or an expression in their brain, if they don't keep that stored in their brain, they can't use it. They can't produce it when they themselves want to create meanings, because language has only one purpose, and that is to make meaning when we communicate, that people will understand us when we speak and we understand them. So what you have on your slide is an example of using one particular kind of enhancement to make a new word noticeable. What do you think is happening here in this picture? Yeah, and please type if chatting is an easier function for you than saying something. I don't even care if you write on the slide.
Yeah. We can always erase it.
Yeah, so this is a picture and we're asking you to connect this, what the image of the picture is telling you, with a new word.
It looks like
Good job, okay. Yes, happy. So this is, and the way we know which word means happy, how do you know it's not Nanik? That means I'm happy.
It's one of our words.
Oh, well, that's cheating.
I know.
It's not fair that you're
by
using,
advantage.
I'm going to get even with you because I'm going to use a language that you don't know in just a very little while. So Sarah is going to follow up on what I've just been saying about the importance of understanding language and giving kids lots of opportunities to practice recalling the meanings of new words, new language, before they produce it.
Great.
Sarah?
Yes.
All yours.
So we're going to do just a quick chat and really just discussing what Mimi was just talking with you about. So if we don't know a word, we're not going to use it. I don't use a ton of words off the 300 most difficult words on the SAT. So while I kind of know the word impecunious, that doesn't come up in my everyday conversation because I don't really know that word, or as Mimi put it, own that word. Okay, so we're not going to be producing those words that we're just not really sure about. So how do you help your students practice their new words before then moving towards using them in speaking and writing? And I'm going to stop share so we can see each other because I know it's a little easier when we're discussing when we can see. And so as you're thinking about that, unmute or pop it in the box. But how do you usually help your students move from just being able to recall the definition of the word and then move to speaking and writing? How do you help them practice?
You could give them a lot of vocabulary exercises, interactive exercises for them to hear the word. For example, you could put the pictures out and say the word, and then they can point to it, kind of like either with a fly swatter or on their hand. And then when, for example, like we're on this unit, animals, they might have a high vocabulary, and then our next sentence is, I'll ask them a question. What is this? And then they use a very short, begin as a very short sentence. This is a rabbit.
Thank you, Susan. And I know when you do your emotions, which is where the happy word came from, you act them out. And they actually act out the emotions as they're saying the word. And then Mila was sharing over in the chat box that she likes to show lots of visuals and sound out the phonetics of the words so students get that practice with actually how it feels in your mouth and to produce it. And Flora was also sharing the idea of doing word maps. Perfect. I appreciate everybody sharing. We're going to jump back in. All right, so now we're going to get into some specific instructional strategies and really look at what those could look like in your classroom. And these pictures that we're viewing here are actually a peek into Charlene's class in Albuquerque. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Liz to talk to us a little bit about instructional strategies.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. So this is a big chart, right, with a lot of information on it. But what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how I approach designing a lesson and why I like to move from less immersive to more immersive teaching methods during a lesson. So rather than focusing on one instructional strategy when I'm putting together a lesson plan, I actually think we need to use a variety of different strategies that all fit together toward the same goal. So I have a table here that lists out that places various teaching strategies on a continuum from less immersive to more immersive, and on a continuum of what the goal is, from more meta-linguistic knowledge, knowledge about the language and how the language works, to being able to communicate within the language. And so ideally we'd want to move from strategies that were in boxes 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., all the way through 9. At 9, we get to the most fully immersive type of teaching that we can do, which is where we're teaching another subject through the language. But that is really overwhelming for students who don't have enough background in the language yet. And a lot of times when we're thinking about using immersive techniques, we actually submerge students rather than immerse them, so that they are kind of drowning in the language without any real context to understand what it is that they're being taught. So I'm going to look at just a minute at box number 1, where we have things that are the least immersive. So these are translation exercises. They are vocabulary lessons where you're just memorizing the vocabulary terms. And things like correcting learners' speech. These are things that come out of a Western model of foreign language education that are very grammar focused, and that might get the students to noticing difference between grammatical forms, but don't really move them toward being able to use the language in everyday life. But as we move through into boxes 2 and 3, we're getting much more immersive. We're still focusing on being able to notice different forms in the language. That might be vocabulary, that might be verb endings, it might be different morphemes or bits of meaning within a word. But we're still looking at how does the language work rather than how can I use the language. The total physical response is much more immersive, and there are different ways of doing total physical response that can be a bit more grammar focused and a bit more communication focused. But ideally we want to use a variety of these methods, sometimes in a spiral design where we're going back and forth and revisiting concepts again. But toward the level of 7, 8, and 9, where we have students actually engaging with the language, acquiring it naturally, and being able to eventually, once they have acquired enough, produce in the language. I just think that we need to be very careful about submerging students when we're trying to immerse students, so that we instead scaffold their learning. So this is something that I call scaffolded immersion, where you're actually providing structure and moving from less immersive to more immersive activities. And that could be within a lecture, it could be within a week or a unit, it could be within the entire curriculum for a semester. I just want to reiterate that I think we need to make sure that we're guiding our students along and not just putting them in an environment where they aren't getting any of the input because it's not in a format that is accessible to them. So, you know, they talk about comprehensible input in the literature. That really just means giving enough context clues that students can understand the point of what's being said. So even when we're doing something that's introducing new vocabulary, we want to make that immersive as much as we can, but using what Mimi was talking about in terms of saliency. So rather than just saying the word and holding up a picture, we want to put that in a complete sentence. So you put it in a complete sentence, but you pause before the word, you pause a little bit after the word, you stress the word with volume, length, with pitch raising. That way the students know what they're focusing on is that one word, but they're getting all of the grammar at the same time. So again, this is just a representation of how we can move from less immersive to more immersive and support students by structuring that immersion for them so that they don't feel overwhelmed and discouraged. So this is scaffolded immersion. What we do in scaffolded immersion is, again, we provide those context clues for the new vocabulary or new terms that we are introducing. It might even be a grammatical form that we're introducing. But we provide those context clues through body language, through acting out, actions, by providing pictures and images. But we need that for comprehensible input, or input that is accessible to students, that gives enough information that they can figure out what we're talking about. We want to move from more structured to more communicative immersion. So we want to move from things that would be just introducing new concepts to eventually them being able to use it in a way. And using it doesn't always have to be saying it. Using new language can be pointing to something, can be acting out the action. It could even be in some forms of total physical response, where one person is narrating a play and everyone else is acting out the play. But again, they're not required yet to actually speak the language, but you can tell that they're learning the language and they're engaging with it. One of the things that we need to do when we're trying to do scaffolded immersion or any kind of immersion is to create a language-rich environment. So I've got a picture here on the slide from one of the communities here, where we're looking at content, right? So you've got new ideas in these pictures, and you've got some language there, but notice that only the target language is used. We aren't using English as a way to get them to understand it. We're just using the image. So that's something that you can do to provide those context clues. You can also create a language-rich environment by having ritual greetings at the beginning of every class. You can introduce yourselves, talk about the weather, remind students, which day it is, and then you can use classroom management phrases throughout the classroom. I believe that's what's on in the pictures here. To, if you're going to say, open your workbook, stand up, it's time to do this, let's sit on the carpet. All of these are phrases that you can teach students at the beginning of the school year and use throughout the school year that helps create a language-rich environment. And we also want to make sure that we're providing enough opportunities for active and collaborative learning. Was there a question? Did you have a question? No, okay. I thought I saw this, and that's, for me, that means there's a question.
In our language, in sign language, that's Huzoon. It's good.
Oh, okay. All right, great. So I'm learning something new today too, so that's fantastic. Thank you. So we want to make sure that we're doing active and collaborative learning as well, so that students can engage with self-talk, so they can talk to themselves in and about the language, even if they don't have fully grammatically formed sentences yet. But they can also talk to each other in the language. So when we have opportunities for students to play with language or play with content, they're going to collaborate with each other. They're going to talk to each other. And ideally, they're doing that more and more in the language. We also want to make sure that they're actively engaged with whatever we're doing in the class, so that it's not passive, where someone is just talking at you and at you and at you over and over again. That instead you have an opportunity to get up and move around the class, that you are acting out what's being said, that you are pointing at pictures, that you are dancing and singing and generally having fun. All of this helps to reduce the what's called the affective filter, or the barrier that we put up when we say language learning is too hard and I just can't get this and this is not for me. But if we're doing something fun instead, and we're having fun with our friends, we're not focusing on the fact that language is hard. We're focusing on the fact that we're having fun and we're getting language through that process. So then we also, again, want to go back to this idea of creating a language-rich environment. One of the things that we really want to avoid doing is correcting learners. It doesn't work very well. I mean, if you think about the 3-year-old who says, remember when we goed to the store yesterday, we goed to the store, and the parent says, yes, we went to the store. And the 3-year-old says, that's what I said, we goed to the store. Right? So it doesn't actually get them to notice it. Noticing occurs more when we notice that our language doesn't match our intended language. So if we can avoid overcorrecting, that will help create a positive environment. Also, we want to make sure that we're saying, you know, that whatever language you're using is good language. When people are learning a second language, they often go through this phase called interlanguage, which is where they're producing language, but it's not exactly fluent and grammatical. It's kind of an in-between language. And we need to go through that stage in order to get to where we can be fluent and grammatically correct. And when I've had a lot of teachers in my experience who've said, you know, to especially adult learners, if you can't speak it properly, don't speak it at all. Well, the result of that is they don't speak it, and then you don't have any learning happening. So we want to make sure we're creating an encouraging environment where we're saying, yes, you used a word. Yes, you used a sentence. Even if it's not fantastically what we might consider perfect, it's still a good use of the language because you're using the language. The other thing is, again, lowering that affective filter, making sure that students are focusing on the thing we're doing rather than on the difficulty of the language. So we want to use games, lots of activities. You can have students actually at the upper grade levels, even at the lower grade levels, if it's structured for them, they can actually create videos so that you can use those materials in future classes. They can create cartoons. You can have poetry contests, songwriting contests. Once students have enough language that they feel comfortable being creative in the language, you give them those opportunities to be creative. And you just are having language everywhere, visually, auditorily. So you've got it through sight, you've got it through sound, you've got it through all different kinds of learning modalities. You could even have, if you're focusing on writing, you could even have embossed cards where they can feel the letters so that you can engage tactilely as well. But you just want to create an environment where language is everywhere, so that some of it, we were talking about earlier, will soak in through osmosis. So I think this is a slide for Mimi.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm glad you made all of those important points, Liz, because I think for us to expect grammatical accuracy from most of our students extends beyond what they can learn in the classroom in the amount of time that we see them. That doesn't mean they won't ever be perfect, but it's not going to be with us for the most part. There are some very useful scales that show just how long it takes to learn a new language with grammatical accuracy, whereas the ability to express your ideas, whether it's in single words or memorize chunks and phrases, will happen much sooner and give those students a sense of accomplishment without necessarily having to worry about whether their language is like a highly educated adult native speaker, which is not possible in a short amount of time. It takes a long time to get there. And many of us don't even get there in our own language. Whether you're an English speaker or Spanish speaker or any other language, it just takes a long, long time. So one of the things that we all have heard over and over again, we have heard repeated, is that repetition is helpful for language learning. And that's true. There are many types of repetition that are helpful for learning a new language. And most of those go along with many of the things that Liz mentioned to you. Repetition that's embedded in a meaningful context. Repetition that you want to pay attention to because it's in a game or an activity that's interesting to you and you want to participate in it. Repetition that is naturally embedded through activities like classroom management phrases and words that you actually learn as a result of the phrase, like may I, followed by any permissions that you expect the students to give. Those are great ways for using repetition to learn new language. But I'd like to go back for a moment to the very first slide that we had that had umoja on it. And you had a symbol accompanying it. Now, do you all remember that? if you nod, I can't tell because I'm not seeing all of you. Okay, we see one person. Okay, thank you. So here's the thing. If I taught you that that symbol was umoja, every time I showed you that flashcard, I would expect you to say umoja. And do you think if I did it 10 times, would you remember to say umoja every time you saw that symbol? But would you have learned the meaning of the word? If you don't assign the proper meaning to a picture, your chances of learning what that word means are decreased to the point where you can't use that word yourself. Because remember, we don't use words, we don't produce words that we own, and part of owning is being sure you know what it means. So all of us have heard words many, many times that we don't use because we're not sure what they mean and because we haven't learned them in a context that's helped us. So we talked about the fact that today is supposed to focus on instructional strategies. So I'm going to share one strategy with you that is an example of the things that we've been talking about. First of all, it's very, very aligned with what Liz said about scaffolded immersive experiences. This has been constructed to help you learn a language. It is not just talk, it is talk with a purpose and a focus and a structure. I have a learning objective in mind. I have 4 individual words I want you to learn. I think you will. It's in a language I think most of you don't know. It happens to be the language. Oh, Liz, the next slide was for you. It was the sandwich method. Should we interrupt and come back to it?
We could, or we could just briefly say what it is and how you could use it in this context.
Sure. Yeah, we didn't get to this side.
Yes. So this is really straightforward. This is the sandwich method. It's not my idea. It comes from other people. But when you are trying to introduce a new word or a new phrase, that you can simply focus on saying it in the L2, but the structure and the scaffolding comes in when you say it in the L1 as well. So you say it in the target language, the language that you are hoping the students learn, and then say it in the language that they already know, and then say it again in the target language. And that way they get the meaning, but your focus is shifted back again to the language that you're trying to learn rather than shifting into English.
So one of the other ways that we can help our students learn new language, whether it's words or structures or phrases, is to think about the job that the brain has. The brain is programmed to make meaning from experience. If you've ever sat at an airport and done any people watching, I'll bet you're sitting there thinking, I'll bet these 2 people are husband and wife, or they can't possibly be husband and wife. Those 2 people could be just friends. And then you start making patterns based on the context that you see. What are they wearing? What's their body language like with each other? What's their age like? What do I know about the world around me that makes me think that these 2 people are or are not strangers with one another? Do you ever do that? I'm a real busybody. I do it all the time. I make up stories about people I see because I'm trying to make meaning from my experience. The brain is programmed to do that. So as language teachers, we can build on what the brain wants us to do, which is tell me how to fit these people together. The brain works just like you might work when you start to do a jigsaw puzzle. I'm assuming everybody has ever done a jigsaw puzzle. Nobody puts one hand in the box of pieces, takes the other hand, gets out another piece, and then says, I wonder how these 2 pieces fit together. That's the hardest way possible to do a jigsaw puzzle. Context is the picture on the box. And most of us look at the picture on the box before we decide how the pieces are going to fit together and which pieces will go where. And learning a new language is facilitated when we know what the picture on the box might look like. So giving kids context, it can be the big picture or it can just be a very small piece of the puzzle, helps students understand how to put pieces together of the language. If you're using graphic organizers, helping students sort meanings, like a Venn diagram where you might have words that describe big, heavy objects and words that might be in the middle and words that might be very small, would be another way to get students to sort vocabulary as a graphic organizer. Themes are helpful because they too are like setting context and background knowledge. What I already know about the world helps me learn new things. So if I said the shark was chasing the fish, I am suspecting that everybody here will probably envision that both the shark and the fish are in water. I don't have to say that because you know about the world. So when we look at how do we teach kids new vocabulary, I'd like you to look at this list of words. And if I said to you, I'm going to give you a quiz in 3 minutes and I want you to list all 10 of these words, I think you'd say, that's hard. But you know what? It's only 10 words of 3 letters each. So what's so hard about learning 10 words? But if I gave you that list, you might say, that's not so easy, until you saw the second list. What makes the second list easier than the first list? Meaning. You already know what all these words mean, right? And if you were really trying to remember 10 words, you would probably say, how can I connect these words so I can remember them? Like, the ant sat for pie. Out of the bug's hip came a mug. He had an eye too. Now that was terrible. Didn't mean anything, but I could do that. I could not do that with that first list, could I? So let's look at the third list. What's different in the third list is not only are these real words, but they have a meaningful connection to each other in pairs. The way they're connected isn't identical. Coat and jacket don't relate the way book and read do, or jump and swim do, but we have something here that gives us a way to pair these. So now we're looking at 5 pairs and not 10 separate words. What makes them pairs is A, they have meaning by themselves, and their meaning is also related to the other word. And now I want to show you the easiest list of all, because every word in this list, does everybody see that? The words in this list not only have meaning for you, but they're connected to every other word in that sentence. So big idea is that when we're teaching our students brand new vocabulary, they will often look at the vocabulary list we give them the same way that you looked at list 1. List 1 doesn't follow any of the rules of phonetics in English. There are no words in English that begin TTL, let alone have only 3 letters that are TTL or XNR. So because they're not linked to each other in a way or a pattern we recognize, we have to learn each individual piece of it one by one by one. So when we have patterns that have connections, then context, like the last example, will help us remember all the vocabulary better. So now I'm going to give you the lesson that's not in English. And Sarah, I'm going to ask you, as I read each sentence, just to move through the slides, okay?
Okay.
Hundrettung. I hope all of you are excited about this story because I know you're really going to love it. Ein Hund. Can you show them the other picture of the Hund, please? Ein Hund ist in dem Wasser. Wasser. Okay. Ein Hund ist im Wasser. Next picture. Die Frau sagt, ach nein, mein Hund, mein Hund. Okay, die Frau, you see her? You see the Hund in dem Wasser? Okay, next slide, please. Der Hund ist im Wasser. Hilf mir, sagt der Hund. Okay. Ein Mann will helfen. Der Mann geht im Wasser. Next slide. Der Mann ist im Wasser. Der Hund schwimmt zum Mann. Der Mann ist im Wasser, der Hund ist im Wasser, der Hund schwimmt zum Mann. Next one, please. Der Mann hat den Hund. Der Mann hat den Hund. Okay. Der Mann bringt den Hund für die Frau. Okay. Die Frau sagt, danke, oh, danke an den Mann. And the last slide. Oh, der Hund, die Frau ist froh. Der Hund ist froh. Okay, let's go on. So, just think for a moment. Did you understand this story? Do you think you followed what was happening? So, this was a very structured story. And actually, most of the meaning load was carried through the visual input. But the words accompanied the visual input. And some of them were cognates. And cognates, a word that looks like a word or sounds like a word in another language, might help you understand the story. Were there any cognates that you noticed? What cognates did anybody notice?
Und, Wasser, Mann.
Good. Okay. And what about schwim? What do you think schwim is? So could you match any of these words with the correct picture? If I showed you. And notice I'm not asking you to say the word. Right now, all I'm trying to do is reinforce the idea that you're learning the meanings of these new words, which is part of the learning process. It's not the whole thing, but it's the beginning of learning 4 new words. So I want you to think for a moment, how many times do you think you heard or read those words? And did that kind of repetition help you understand the meanings of the new words? Yeah, so it turns out that stories really help us create opportunities for meaningful repetition, because while I could just stand in front of you or showed you a picture of a dog and said, Hund, 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 it's probably not as likely to catch your attention as when it's embedded in something like a story. So we know that stories are one form, not the only form, of presenting new language to students. Because of the time crunch, I wasn't able to include some stories that I made up like in 5 minutes off Google Pictures that maybe when we have our follow-up conversation, I can show you how easy it is to do a story like this. where we're getting our students to hear the words meaningfully used over and over again in a way that allows, after just 5 minutes, you, as of course skilled language learners, understood 4 or 5 words by the end of the story. I actually didn't give you the quiz that I have, but I actually have a quiz that I've used afterward for people to see how much they learned in such a short period of time. So just a brief summary. Helpful repetition means meaningful repetition and multiple encounters in varied, meaningful contexts. When we have background knowledge, we're able to connect the old with the new, and that gives us more hooks in our brain with which to attach new learning. If you think of the brain as, well, this is a terrible example because this is really not true, but if you imagine a pegboard, the more hooks that are on your pegboard, the more things you can hang from those hooks. So, story, multiple meaningful encounters for students. So Sarah, I think you're going to pick up here and talk about Goldilocks a little bit.
Yes. So just kind of recapping the information that you were just learning through the story with the dog and the meaningful repetition there. And we were just bringing it around to, if you think about Goldilocks, and lots of the stories that kids listen to and have read to them when they are young, all of them have lots of repetition. So when you think about Goldilocks, how many words are repeated throughout that? And which words do you think that's really driving home in Goldilocks as she encounters each of her 3 bears in very similar ways? And how naturally does it come across then what each of those words mean to our very youngest children who are just learning? And you could use that exact same story or type of story in any language with that meaningful repetition where they're being exposed to those same words in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that seems familiar to them, and then giving them ways to encounter those words in varied contexts. So as we move forward, I'm going to turn it back over to Mimi to talk a little bit about productive practice.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So before I talked about ways in which you practice understanding meanings, but then there comes the point where you've got to practice producing language. And in this regard, I think that productive practice is a little bit like learning how to ride a bike in one way. You cannot learn how to ride a bike without riding the bike. You have to get on the bike to learn how to ride a bike. Watching other people ride a bike does not help you ride a bike. It gives you some ideas, but ultimately the only way to get good at riding a bike is to be on the bike. So what kinds of activities should we be providing our students in our classrooms that give them practice using the language? Liz mentioned games and activities that are motivating and interesting that make the kids want to speak. So those kinds of things are meaningful. They're saying something that has meaning to them. They have a purpose, like I want to be the first one to say the word, or I want to communicate an idea to you that's of my own. They have to be varied, because if you do the same activity every single day, then at some point students just stop being engaged. And Liz talked about being an actively engaged learner, and that students do better when they're active learners rather than they're just listening to us talk. Student communication, student use of the language has to be frequent because they need a lot of oral practice to get good at it. I just got a new bike a year ago. It has 1 mile on it. I don't think I'm riding my bike enough because it's still hard to do. Frequent practice makes kids feel more comfortable. It gives them, I know if you've taught reading, you've heard the terms fluency and automaticity. and fluency and automaticity are fostered by frequent use, purposeful, meaningful, unrehearsed, and authentic language practice. I want to give you sort of a mantra that I've come to believe very strongly in. When we have students practice language, they are not learning how to use the language. Learning is using. They're not learning it in order to use it. The learning emerges from the use. Using is learning. And another word for using is productive practice. So the more your students use the language, the more likely they are to be able to use the language. People who study neuroscience and cognitive science have told us that when you want to learn how to do a real life task, the more your practice activities are like the kind of things you really have to do in the real world, the more the transfer is from the practice of the task to the real life task. So that's why we let young drivers practice driving in parking lots instead of on the PlayStation. Because the more that their practice simulates what they're going to have to do independently, the more likely that it is for them to be able to use it. So students also have to be able to engage in unrehearsed communication, because if all they can say is stuff they've memorized, what do they do when the person they're talking to doesn't know their half of the dialogue? So hold on to these ideas as you begin to plan your lessons using the formats that Liz gave you, and ask yourself, am I providing students the kind of practice that leads to the ability to use language? So can we go on? Next slide.
So now we're going to have Liz kind of walk us through a language lesson structure and a sample language lesson.
Thank you, Sarah. So a couple of things to remember as we're creating our language lessons, building on what Mimi has said as well, is that we want to structure this. We want to give new language in a way that can be accessed by the learners. So we want to give it in context. We also want to not just keep doing repetition type activities. We want to move toward activities that are meaningful and authentic, as Mimi said, that are engaging and that get the learners to engage with the language in multiple ways. So a potential structure could be that you have a ritual class opening where you talk about the weather, you talk about what did you do this weekend, how are you feeling, so some content that they've already had, and then you're repeating that and reinforcing that again so that it becomes automatic. Then you can introduce new content. You can use picture flashcards to do that, again, using as many complete sentences as possible, but using stress, volume, pausing to introduce the new content within those sentences. You want to engage with the content through a lot of different type of activities, including total physical response, where you ask them to act out the meaning. You can also ask them to, you could ask questions like, you've introduced the concept of rabbit, and now you show us a series of pictures and you ask which one is the rabbit, or is this a rabbit? And then students can say yes or no. You could give them other content as well and ask them which is a rabbit, and get them to actually begin using the word once they feel comfortable with it. You can tell a story, show a story with the new content in it, and then you can have them play a game with the new content, so that you're moving through these different instructional strategies and different levels of immersion, to where they're actually now playing a game using the content in the language, which is fully immersive. You can have the next slide. Thank you. So this is a sample lesson plan, and I call it Beyond Colors, Numbers, and Shapes, even though it uses colors and numbers. The numbers and colors would be content that the learners have already been exposed to, that this is previously covered. The outcomes for this particular lesson are that we want learners to be able to understand and eventually say the names of 5 animals. The numbers and colors have already been covered. We want them to be able to say a correctly formatted noun phrase consisting of 2 adjectives and a noun, like 2 black mice or 3 white dogs. We want them to first recognize that and then be able to produce it later. We want them to be able to form correct questions and answers, or at least recognize correct questions and answers, so that you could say, what is this? And they could either say the word if they're at that point, or they could point to the picture. So you would say, you know, Nanta ilapat, what is this? And then they would point to the chokfi, which would be the rabbit, or they could point to the ofi, which would be the dog. Depending on which content you had given them. And then we want them to actually apply what they have learned to a real world problem. So this is when the game comes in. This is when doing something fun, using the language is your ultimate goal here. So if we can have the next slide. Thank you. So this is a lot on this slide. You have this on a handout as well, as far as I understand that you have a handout with this. This is a sample lesson that demonstrates how you would move from introducing new content through all the way through getting to a game. So we start out with our regular classroom introductions, you know, hello, what day is today? What is the weather like? Things that students already feel comfortable with, so that they're now in the frame that, okay, we're using the language and this is not too scary. And then we would introduce the new content. In this case, it's vocabulary terms related to animals. So we have bunny, dog, cat, mouse, and snake. And you would put those in sentences like ilapat sinti, which is, this is a snake. Ilapat chokvi, this is a bunny. Ilapat katos, this is a cat. So that you're not just holding up a picture and saying the word in the picture, but that you're giving it within a correct grammatical context. So you would introduce that new content, and then you could have a quick quiz where you show students the cards, and you ask, which one is the bunny, and they point to the bunny. Which one is the dog, and they point to the dog. Eventually, you would ask them to be able to fill in the blank. If you ask the question, what is this? And you would say, Nanta ilapat, and they would say, ilapat chokfi. This is a bunny. Then you could integrate the content with actions. So now you're using a little total physical response. So you're enforcing the vocabulary terms by asking, what does a chokfi do? What does a rabbit do? And then you act out a rabbit. What does a dog do? And then you act out a dog. You could turn this into a Simon Says type game. And then eventually what you want to do is move into using phrases. So we've gone from just being able to say, this is a bunny, or point to this is a bunny, or answer the question, is this a bunny, and say yes or no. Now what we're doing is putting those in other phrases. So we're bringing in the content that we've already used, which are colors and numbers. And so now we're saying, these are 3 white bunnies, and you hold up a picture of 3 white bunnies, and you use your fingers to say, these are 3, and then you circle the color white, and then bunnies. And you do this with all of the content. And then you do maybe another quick quiz where you ask, are these 3 white bunnies? And they can say no. And you can say, are these 2 white bunnies? And they can say yes. You can say, point to the picture with the 3 white bunnies, and the students can do that. So the focus here is on the new vocabulary, but all of the grammar that's in the complete sentences is kind of being learned on the sly. So you're not focusing on the grammar, but the grammar is getting into people's brains anyway. Just as you're focusing on the salient new word, but all of that other content is important too. Finally, you could move this into a game. So I've actually done this lesson over the course of 3 weeks with 2nd grade students who were not Choctaw. And we went through all of these different stages, and then at the very end, we had a friendly competition that was a scavenger hunt, and it was a silent scavenger hunt. So they were not supposed to talk at all during this activity, but they had learned the words in writing as well for all of these phrases. So I gave the students a list of sentences like, these are 3 white bunnies, these are 2 yellow dogs. And I had hidden pictures of 3 white bunnies or 2 yellow dogs around the room. And so they had to go and collect the pictures. And the first group that got this done got a small prize. All the groups got a prize, of course. But it was really fun for them to be able to engage with this game and use what they had learned and demonstrate what they had learned, even though they were doing it completely silently. And then I'll tell you that 6 months later, I chaperoned a field trip for these students again. And I started asking them questions in Choctaw, and they were still able to answer the questions after 6 months. So just doing this actually got them to learn that content. That was a fun, proud day. So this is just, again, a sample lesson. You could do all kinds of different things, but it's just a model of how you can go from your ritual greetings to new content, to reinforcing and repeating that content, to putting it in multiple ways of accessing it while giving good context clues, and eventually getting toward a completely immersive game. But you could do this without ever having the students have to produce any language, or you could move toward them producing language as they get more comfortable with the content. So we have the next slide. Yes, okay. So this is a graphic that shows you how the activities in this lesson actually move back and forth between the different levels of immersion and different goals, including the knowledge about the language and communication. So we go from the ritual greetings, which are completely immersive, and we end with the ritual greetings, which are fairly immersive. But then you notice that we're going from level 5 to 4 to 3 to 4 to 6 to 5, so that we're helping the students, and we're using different levels of immersion and helping them notice what's going on in the classroom at the same time.
All right. So you've heard lots of different ideas and tips, and now we'd like to hear some from you as well. So as we talked about at the top of the webinar, we'd love to know some of the instructional strategies that you've used in your classroom. And because we have a little bit of a smaller group, I'm not going to have us actually write on the board, because I know that sometimes takes a little bit more time, and we're a little short on time. So I'm just going to have us unmute, or you can pop it over in the chat box. What is a strategy that you've used with your students that you think is particularly effective or has really just worked well for you?
I've used, we have a lot of cards, the picture cards. And so we've used that in the basic sentences. I'd like to move towards putting the cards, for example, we're doing animals. And so I'd like to move towards having the students take the cards and put them in the sentence order, but just swapping out, keeping that same pattern, and they could just swap out the cards. One thing that we've just tried last week, it was interactive, because I teach over distance. So I tried Pear Deck for a version of assessments, and that was pretty cool, because I could actually see. All I had to do was say a word, and the students were able to indicate on screen what word it was.
Very nice. Yeah, Susan gets to spend a lot of quality time on Zoom, so she's our Zoom pro. All right, anybody else?
From San Carlos, our teachers are incorporating a lot of purposeful play activities, modeling play and modeling life skills with the students, like reenacting the grocery store with the doll babies and the items in the kitchen, or they have traditional clothing that the students can try on, and that they have matching clothing that the doll babies can try on. So there's a lot of purposeful play, especially in the Head Start program. In the older grades, a lot of the activities are more oral, where the students are engaged with one another and they're having directed conversations with one another in the kinder and first grade classrooms.
Thanks, Becky. No, I loved watching the baby dolls in the camp dresses with the kids. It's so cute.
It's super cute. Today I was in one of the preschool classes, and the little girl first got herself dressed in the camp dress, and then she put the doll baby in the camp dress, and then she picked up a little tiny plastic, like little figurine of a baby doll, and so she put the little baby doll in the doll baby's arms, and then she put the doll baby in her arms, and so it was like a 3-tiered, all in camp dresses rocking one another. It was too cute. But she was in Apache saying, the teacher translated for me, but she was saying, okay, night night, okay, go to bed, sleep now, as she was rocking the baby, all in Apache.
Yeah, all the things that she's probably heard and knows, those are the appropriate things to say with her baby.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. All right. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to jump us back in, but if you think of any other strategies you want to share, we'll both have time today at the end, if you want to pop them in the chat box now, or then also we'll share an opportunity at the end where you'll have another good opportunity to share with each other. So I want us to make sure and get to some specific considerations for native language educators. And so I'm going to turn it over to Liz to talk a bit about that.
Thank you, Sarah. So specific considerations for teachers of native language are to consider what are your program goals. For each community, those are going to be different. It's not always realistic to expect that if you have an hour a week or even 5 hours a week in the language that you're going to be able to get your learners to fluency. But having realistic goals is really important. You may be able to get your learners to the point where they can use the language symbolically, recognize greetings, engage in culturally appropriate communicative practice, even if they aren't doing it with complete fluency in the language. So thinking about what your goals are will really help shape how you're teaching the language. We want to make sure that we are encouraging rather than discouraging new speakers. Oftentimes, in my experience, I know that new speakers get discouraged because they can't produce things as fluently as possible, as fluently as they would like, given their current abilities. So just saying that, any language use is good language use. Anytime that we are using some language, it means that we are using some language. I mean, think about that. We're actually doing good work in that case. We want to make sure that we are thinking about how we can incorporate culturally appropriate content and methods. People have probably heard about traditional ecological knowledge and its relationship to health, but also to language learning. I know that there are a lot of people in Arizona who are engaging with this. So you might take students out on a field trip. So rather than just learning the names and pictures for a particular cactus fruit or the kinds of foods that might have been gathered or grown. For example, Three Sisters in Chickasaw country. This is corn, beans, and squash that are grown together because they support each other while they're growing, and it's a traditional practice. Well, you could learn the word for corn and beans and squash, but if you go into the field and are planting corn, beans, and squash or harvesting corn, beans, and squash, that becomes much more meaningful to people. We also want to make sure that the methods that we're using are appropriate. So there are a variety of different total physical response methods, but not all of them would be appropriate. Say, if you're in a community class teaching elders, you wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable asking the elders to, or giving them an imperative command, telling them, stand up, sit down, open the door, close the door. But I know a teacher who wanted to use this method, and so she gave the students in the class puppets, and then she said the puppets do this, and so everyone was acting out with the puppets. So that displaced the command, so she wasn't telling an elder to do something. She was telling the puppet to do something, and that worked really well for that teacher in that context. So thinking about which methods are most appropriate to your community and which ones support your goals are really important. I think we also need to remember, along with encouraging, that we're trying to motivate our students. We're trying to get them to keep learning. I think of myself as a language learner. People say, you know, do you know Choctaw? And I say, no, I'm learning Choctaw. I will always be learning Choctaw. And I think it's okay to be a learner and not to worry about whether I ever get to the point where I can be fluent. And that's something that keeps me motivated, that I can keep learning. Next slide. Thank you. So this is an example. On the left, we see somebody who's engaged in traditional harvesting. That's the kind of thing that you could do with with traditional ecological knowledge. You could incorporate that. Going on field trips, using the language in the wild, right? Language in the wild, language as it was meant to be used to communicate about things rather than as a topic of instruction. And then on the right, we see an example of how you could have people engaged in total physical response in language learning methods that are culturally appropriate, so that you are not offending and you're not alienating people within your culture. And then finally, some key considerations here for effective immersion in particular. I've mentioned this a couple of times, but rather than just giving a flashcard with a word, we want to make sure that we are speaking in complete sentences. Back to that, creating a language-rich environment. So having language everywhere, visually, at the beginning and at the end of the lesson, as well as with the new content in the lesson. That you want to spend as much time as you can in the language, but not feel discouraged if you have to use a little bit of English to do so. You want to structure those early immersion activities so that students don't feel overwhelmed and submerged. Keep using active and collaborative learning, avoid correcting, and use games as much as possible.
And then Mimi was going to just kind of wrap us up with just kind of a reminder about this idea of the multiple pathways through multiple stimulations.
So we started by saying you can't use words that you don't know. And another way to say that is that knowing them, learning them, means that they're in your brain. And the more ways that you can connect the meanings of those words with the sound of the word, what it looks like, the context, your background knowledge, your personal experience, then the more ways you have to pull up those little bits of information from where they've been stored in the brain. And it's that kind of connection, interconnection, that helps students remember things that they have simply memorized. And I think that you've had a lot of examples of how that might happen in the classroom. Unfortunately, we didn't have a chance to hear as many of the things that you're already doing that are like that, but maybe we'll have an opportunity when we have a follow-up to hear how you're using these very same ideas or theories and putting them into your own instructional practice.
Thank you. And we know that we've gone through a lot of content today, and so we wanted to kind of think about some ways that you can continue your learning as you've talked about these different ideas and strategies. So some of the things that our two experts had suggested were attending intensive workshops or conferences, and if possible to go as a cohort with your other teaching peers so that you're all engaging in this professional development together and then can work together on implementation and support one another, which is also similar to this idea of the teaching circle and being able to support one another in that way. Also engaging in book studies, and you'll see in the resource database there are a number of resources that our experts have shared that we'll be putting up there that you could then access, whether it be online articles, journals, or books that could be used for a book study. And then making assessment a key part of your curricular and teaching design. You want to assess teaching and learning and attainment of your program goals. So really looking at not just what the students are achieving, but also how is it working from the instructional standpoint, and is this actually getting you towards your program goals? Is this actually moving the needle toward what your goal is? And I know all of you are really on the page with program goals as we've been talking about APR reporting the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to give you some time for questions at the end, but I know a couple of you have some classes to get to. So I want to make sure that I get you to this date, and then we'll come back to the question piece. So we will have a follow-up group coaching session. This is a new thing we're doing this year on topics of high interest, where you're able to then get back together, not just with your grantee peers, but with both Dr. Met and Dr. Kickham, and be able to come together and talk about, maybe you tried some of the strategies and ideas that you learned about today. Maybe you want some feedback on things that you're doing in your classroom now, and just an opportunity for us to all share and ask questions. So we're going to be doing that April 14th. That's a Tuesday, and it'll be from 4:30 to 5:30 Eastern. We'll send out a calendar invite after this, but to go ahead and put that on your calendar as the next opportunity to engage around this topic. And then some next steps for you. Like I said, all the resources will be in the resource database. You'll be able to download the 3 handouts for this webinar as well as the recording. So if you want to share this with a colleague, maybe your project director, whoever you think it would be useful for, the recording will be there with those, as well as the associated resources for you to continue your learning. Between now and the time when we're together, April 14th, try out at least one new strategy, one new idea, and then we can report back, all of us, and kind of talk about how that worked. And then make sure to put down any questions or ideas for that group coaching session. And our next webinar is actually March 26th. That is going to be our annual performance reporting webinar. That'll be from 3:30 to 5 on Thursday, March 26th. And then we are going to go ahead and put the feedback survey up over in the chat box, if you don't mind taking just a few minutes to complete that. And while that chat box feedback survey is coming up, I'm going to actually let you do this in the chat box so that we can take your other questions as well. But what's something that you'd like to learn more about with respect to second language instructional strategies? And I'm going to put that up in the chat box as well, just to make it easier. But are there any other areas or topics that you would like to learn more about in regards to second language instructional strategies or anything related? And while I put that up in the chat box, if you have any questions for either one of our experts, feel free to unmute and ask away, or pop it over in the chat box and I will ask it for you. And I know both Mila and Susan both had classes starting right as this webinar ended, so they had to get off right on time to start teaching the children. So they both sent private messages that they were having to hop off, but that they appreciated the time, and we'll see them back on the 14th. And if you don't have any other questions, if you'd like to just click on that SurveyMonkey survey, we really appreciate the feedback. It helps us as we plan upcoming technical assistance. And then have a lovely rest of your Thursday, and we'll see you back on April 14th.